When discussing the legends of the NFL, Terry Bradshaw's name often emerges with a blend of reverence and debate. Known for leading the Pittsburgh Steelers to 4 Super Bowl victories in the 1970s, Bradshaw carved a legacy as a winner with unmatched postseason prowess. But beyond the championships and accolades lies the question, how good was Terry Bradshaw actually? Could he still be an elite quarterback in the modern era? This video aims to provide an evaluation of Bradshaw's career, examining his strengths, weaknesses, and how he compared to other quarterbacks of his era. While Bradshaw had been a talented athlete for his whole life, he really came into being a star when he started to attend Louisiana Tech University. While the school itself isn't really known for producing high-level football talent, by the time Bradshaw was able to secure the starting role going into his junior season, Bradshaw had become one of the best prospects in the nation. In 1968, he passed for nearly 2,900 yards, alongside 22 touchdowns, which actually placed him 3rd in the nation for passing yards and 2nd in the nation for touchdowns. That level of play attracted the attention of NFL scouts, who thought Bradshaw was developing into a perfect quarterback for the pro level. His senior year was also a great season, throwing for 2,300 yards and another 14 touchdowns. While today that might seem a little low for an entire season, it's important to remember that passing has come a long way since the late 60s and early 70s. Quarterbacks now are throwing way more passes in offensive schemes designed specifically for them. During Bradshaw's college days, there was a much larger emphasis on the running game. The best example I can have for this is just looking at college stats from last year. The top 5 college quarterbacks in 2023 had an average of 334 passing attempts in a season. During his senior year, Bradshaw threw the ball just 248 times. Coming into the NFL, it was assumed that Bradshaw was going to be an early first-round pick. He was known as the best quarterback coming into the draft, and the Pittsburgh Steelers ended up with the 1st overall pick after winning a coin toss with the Bears. Both teams had gone just 1-13 the season before, and both teams were in need of a quarterback. The Steelers selected him 1st overall, and he soon came into the season as the presumptive future of the franchise. While now Terry Bradshaw is known for winning 4 Super Bowls and developing the Steelers dynasty of the 70s, things were not incredible at the start of his career at all. Despite being the 1st overall pick, he was forced to split his starting duties his rookie season with Terry Hanratty. The increased speed of the NFL game was hard for Bradshaw to adjust to, and his first season was the definition of abysmal. In 8 starts, he had 1,400 yards and 6 touchdowns, alongside 24 interceptions. That's right, the future Hall of Fame quarterback threw 400% more interceptions than touchdowns in his first season in the league. While most quarterbacks would have been destroyed by such a poor performance, Bradshaw was not the type to let it affect his confidence. That is one thing I think Bradshaw had that is different from most modern NFL players. I feel like a lot of the draft busts we talk about today have their confidence shattered by poor performance and never get it back. Look at the difference in how Bryce Young carries himself now when compared to his play in college. It takes a special amount of mental fortitude to be able to bounce back from such a garbage season, take the pressure from the media, fans, and teammates, while still being able to pull it together. It also is important to note that on top of his poor performance, there was a time where Terry Bradshaw was not beloved by the media. While now he is a centerpiece of NFL broadcasts, when he first got to the league, the media viewed him as a country bumpkin who wasn't smart enough to cut it in the NFL. That obviously is absurd, but at the time, many people thought he didn't have what it took to cut it in the NFL. It didn't help that in his 2nd year, he had another rough season that made him look like he could have been a mistake. He did manage to throw for about 800 more yards than his rookie campaign, but still struggled massively with turnovers. He threw 13 touchdowns to 22 interceptions, and going into his 3rd year, it was made clear that he had to get his turnovers under control if they were going to keep him as a starter. Going into year 3, he was just 8-13 as a starter, but something clicked for Bradshaw. He managed to take the Steelers to an 11-3 record, alongside dropping his interceptions to just 12 on the year. They strode into the playoffs an underdog, but Bradshaw was able to showcase the skill that would come to define him, an ability to perform in big games and clutch situations when they matter most. In the divisional round of the playoffs, Bradshaw led the Steelers on a late game drive that was capped off by Franco Harris and the immaculate reception to to get the Steelers into the AFC Championship game against the Miami Dolphins. This was the infamous Dolphins team that was in the middle of what would become a perfect season, and while Bradshaw was able to keep the game competitive, fate had determined the Dolphins were going to be the team to complete a perfect season, and the Steelers would fall with a final score of 21-17. This season was crucial for Bradshaw, as it allowed him to win over a lot of the Steelers fan base and silence his critics. Sure, his first 2 years had been rough, but he had managed to drastically improve his game and take the Steelers all the way to one game before the Super Bowl. He came into the 1973 season as the presumptive starter yet again, and managed to get the Steelers to an 8-1 record alongside 1,100 yards passing and 10 touchdowns. The interception bug was back though, and he had 5 more interceptions than touchdowns. He suffered a separated shoulder after getting off to the start of a solid year, and wound up being replaced by Terry for the remainder of the season. When he came back, the Steelers had managed to return to the playoffs, but for a quarterback coming back from a shoulder injury can be incredibly difficult. Despite starting the year 8-1, they had fallen to 10-4 on the year and barely secured a wildcard spot. Their matchup was a rematch of the divisional round from 1972, but this time the Raiders would put on an elite defensive performance to secure a 33-14 victory. Bradshaw played like an absolute trash can in this matchup, throwing just 167 yards alongside 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. While he had taken the Steelers to the AFC Championship the year before, there was once again question marks on if Bradshaw was talented enough to get the team over the hump. However, 1974 would come to be another career-defining year for Bradshaw, once again featuring his ability to be one of the toughest mental competitors in football. In 1974, Terry Bradshaw's season began with turbulence as a strike forced the Steelers to move him down on the depth chart. Steelers coach Chuck Noll benched Bradshaw in favor of Terry Hanratty and later Joe Gilliam, hoping for more stability. It didn't help that a strike further pushed Bradshaw on the depth chart. However, both replacements faltered, leading to Bradshaw's return toward the latter part of the season. With a point to prove, Bradshaw led the Steelers on an impressive 5-1 run as the starter, securing a playoff berth. Entering the postseason as underdogs, few believed Pittsburgh had any shot at a Super Bowl title, but Bradshaw's game transformed when it mattered most. He embraced playoff pressure and showcased his growth as a quarterback. The Steelers overcame the Bills and outlasted the Raiders in hard-fought victories before facing the Vikings in the Super Bowl. With newfound poise, Bradshaw helped guide the Steelers to their first championship, throwing 3 touchdowns to just 1 interception across the playoffs and proving that he was ready to lead at the highest level. Fresh off their first Super Bowl victory, Terry Bradshaw had solidified his role as the Steelers' unquestioned starting quarterback. The 1975 season saw him elevate his game further, passing for 2,000 yards and posting an impressive 18 touchdowns to just 9 interceptions. Under Bradshaw's leadership, Pittsburgh finished the regular season with a dominant 12-2 record, establishing themselves as clear contenders to defend their championship title. In the playoffs, Bradshaw stepped up to deliver his most formidable postseason performance to date. He amassed over 500 passing yards across 3 games, tossing 3 touchdowns despite 5 interceptions. While not flawless, his efforts combined with the Steelers' fearsome defense propelled the team through a tough playoff gauntlet and secured back-to-back Super Bowl championships. It is important to note now that while Bradshaw had just won back-to-back Super Bowls, it wasn't like he was carrying the team there by himself. He had the Steel Curtain defense, which to this day is one of the greatest defensive units to ever play. This kept them in a lot of games, even when Bradshaw was not playing his best. It also is a huge help when you have elite receivers to throw it to. Bradshaw had 2 future Hall of Fame receivers on his roster. John Stallworth and Lynn Swann both were incredible receivers who managed to save plays other receivers would have lost. We also can't talk about any offense in the 70s without mentioning the run game, and Franco Harris was another incredible Steelers player from this era who ended up in the Hall of Fame. Looking back at it, this Steelers team was absolutely stacked, and of course that had a huge impact on making Bradshaw look incredible. If he hadn't been on a roster as incredible as this, there is a good chance his early career would have led to him being benched permanently. In 1976, the high physicality of the game is what really took Bradshaw out. He had to battle wrist and neck injuries that caused him to miss 4 games. When he was on the field, he was beat up, throwing for just 1,100 yards alongside 10 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. The Steelers did manage to squeak into the playoffs, and Bradshaw played well in the 2 games they had, but they were knocked out before reaching the Super Bowl. The 1977 season was another mixed chapter in Terry Bradshaw's career. He led the Steelers to a respectable 9-5 record, throwing for 2,500 yards and tallying 17 touchdowns. However, his gunslinger style, reminiscent of Brett Favre's risk-taking play, came with consequences. Bradshaw also threw 19 interceptions. While his aggressive approach often kept defenses on their toes, it also resulted in costly mistakes. This was never more evident than in the playoffs, where Bradshaw had one of the worst performances of his postseason career. In their first round game, he managed just 1 touchdown while throwing 3 interceptions, a trio of turnovers that sealed Pittsburgh's early exit. It was clear that 3 giveaways in a playoff matchup was a recipe for disaster, leaving the Steelers and Bradshaw with more questions than answers. Yet, redemption was just around the corner, as 1978 would see Bradshaw ascend to MVP form and lead the team into an era-defining season. The 1978 season was the pinnacle of Terry Bradshaw's career, marking his transformation into one of the league's elite quarterbacks. Coming off a disappointing playoff performance the year prior, Bradshaw was determined to elevate his game. He delivered an MVP-level season, throwing for over 2,900 yards and a league-leading 28 touchdowns, complemented by 20 interceptions, a testament to his high-risk, high-reward play style. The Steelers finished with a stellar 14-2 record, dominating the AFC with Bradshaw at the helm. In the playoffs, he showcased his growth and leadership, guiding the team to victories over formidable opponents and proving clutch when it mattered most. Bradshaw's offensive prowess, paired with Pittsburgh's powerhouse defense, led the Steelers to another Super Bowl appearance. In Super Bowl 13, he outdueled Roger Staubach and the Dallas Cowboys, throwing for 318 yards and 4 touchdowns, securing his first Super Bowl MVP award and solidifying the Steelers' place as a dynasty. The 1979 season further cemented Terry Bradshaw's legacy as one of the greats. Fresh off an MVP season and Super Bowl victory, Bradshaw was determined to continue his dominance. He threw for over 3,700 yards, an impressive feat for the era, and recorded 26 touchdowns to 25 interceptions. While his aggressive play style still led to turnovers, it was clear that Bradshaw's confidence and command of the Steelers' offense were unmatched. Pittsburgh finished the season 12-4, securing their place atop the AFC and heading into the playoffs with high expectations. In the postseason, Bradshaw's leadership was on full display as he navigated the Steelers through tough matchups. He brought his best when it mattered most, leading Pittsburgh to a hard-fought victory over the Los Angeles Rams in Super Bowl 14. Despite trailing in the fourth quarter, Bradshaw's clutch throws, including a 73-yard touchdown pass to John Stallworth, sealed the win. He earned his second Super Bowl MVP, guiding the Steelers to their 4th championship in 6 years, and solidifying their reputation as the team of the decade. The 1980 season was a turning point for Terry Bradshaw and the Steelers. After the highs of 4 Super Bowl championships in 6 years, the team was feeling the weight of age and injuries, and Bradshaw's season was a reflection of that struggle. He threw for over 3,300 yards with 24 touchdowns, but also racked up a career-high 25 interceptions, a number that showcased his all-or-nothing style, but also hinted at his growing inconsistency. The Steelers finished with a disappointing 9-7 record, a stark contrast to their recent dominance. For the first time in years, Pittsburgh missed the playoffs, bringing an end to their era of Super Bowl runs. While Bradshaw's arm strength and gunslinger mentality were still assets, the Steelers as a whole struggled to maintain the intensity and cohesion that had defined their dynasty years. The 1980 season marked the start of a slow decline for both Bradshaw and the Steelers, who would spend the next few years battling injuries, roster changes, and the pressure of living up to the legacy they'd built in the 1970s. From 1981 until his retirement in 1983, Terry Bradshaw's career entered its final challenging phase. In 1981, he still displayed flashes of brilliance, throwing for nearly 2,900 yards and 22 touchdowns, though his 14 interceptions reflected a continued struggle with turnovers. The Steelers finished with an 8-8 record, falling short of the playoffs as the once dominant roster showed signs of aging and wear. The 1982 season, shortened by a player's strike, saw Bradshaw lead Pittsburgh to a 6-3 record and a playoff appearance. He threw 17 touchdowns to only 11 interceptions in 9 games, showing he still had competitive fire. However, the Steelers were knocked out in the first round by the San Diego Chargers, a loss that underscored the challenges of maintaining a playoff contending team with a fading dynasty roster. Bradshaw's final season in 1983 was plagued by injuries. He managed only one appearance that year, famously playing through intense pain and throwing 2 touchdown passes before aggravating his elbow injury, a moment that ultimately ended his career. After undergoing surgery, Bradshaw decided to retire, closing the chapter on a legendary 14-season run with the Steelers. He walked away with 4 Super Bowl rings, 2 Super Bowl MVPs, and an enduring legacy as one of the NFL's most fearless quarterbacks. Terry Bradshaw is undeniably a Hall of Fame-worthy player, a 4-time Super Bowl champion who led the Steelers to unprecedented success in the 1970s. But while his accomplishments are legendary, a closer look reveals that his career stats don't necessarily align with the elite consistency we see from some of his contemporaries. Bradshaw's performance at his peak, especially during his 1978 MVP season and his back-to-back Super Bowl wins, is unforgettable and cemented his reputation as a clutch player who excelled when it mattered most. However, throughout much of his career, he didn't display the same week-in, week-out dominance or statistical production that other elite quarterbacks did, even in his era. Compared to contemporaries like Dan Fouts, Jim Hart, and Ken Anderson, Bradshaw falls short in overall yards and touchdowns, largely due to a rough start to his career. His early years with the Steelers were marked by interceptions, low yardage totals, and an offense that sometimes struggled to find rhythm. Bradshaw's inconsistency through much of the 1970s contrasts sharply with players like Fouts, who consistently posted high yardage seasons, or Anderson, who was known for his accuracy and steady production. Bradshaw's peak in the late 70s brought him accolades and championships, but he struggled to maintain the steady output that defines some of the most celebrated quarterbacks in NFL history. Within the Steelers franchise, Bradshaw remains a legend, second all-time in passing records, and celebrated as a key architect of the team's first dynasty. Yet his statistical average nature across several seasons is a reminder of the variance in his performance. He was undoubtedly the right man for the Steelers during their Super Bowl era, but when held up against the likes of Marino or Manning, Bradshaw's record appears inconsistent. His legacy, while secure, speaks more to a player who mastered the biggest moments rather than one who could dominate every season with sheer consistency. Today, Bradshaw shines in his role as a broadcaster, where his personality and charisma keep him in the spotlight. His impact on football culture is unquestionable, as is his clutch postseason play. But evaluating him purely by stats or consistency puts him in a unique category, a quarterback who embodied grit, seized the big moments, and won championships, even if he wasn't always statistically dominant. In the end, Bradshaw's legacy is as a rare type of quarterback, one who may not have the gaudy stats of others, but whose legacy of championships speaks volumes. Nostalgia has a way of amplifying Terry Bradshaw's legacy, sometimes elevating him higher on all-time lists than his career stats alone might suggest. There's no denying his achievements as a 4-time Super Bowl champion, and he was a key piece of the Steelers dynasty. But when you take a closer look, it's clear that Bradshaw's career was heavily bolstered by the elite supporting cast around him. With the Steel Curtain defense, Hall of Famers like Franco Harris and Lynn Swann, and one of the best coaches in NFL history in Chuck Noll, Bradshaw played with the kind of support most quarterbacks could only dream of. While he certainly rose to the occasion on the biggest stage, his regular season performance wasn't always consistent or exceptional compared to other quarterbacks of his time. In many ways, Bradshaw was like Brett Favre before Brett Favre, a gunslinger who wasn't afraid to take risks, even if it meant a high number of interceptions. This high-risk, high-reward style led to both spectacular victories and painful defeats. When it worked, Bradshaw looked unstoppable, tossing deep bombs and leading the Steelers to victory. But when it didn't, it often resulted in games full of turnovers and disappointing losses. His interception rate was one of the highest of his era, and there were seasons where he struggled with accuracy and decision-making. Unlike the consistently high-level play of a Joe Montana or a Dan Fouts, Bradshaw's career is filled with both peaks and valleys. The truth is, if Bradshaw hadn't been part of such a dominant team, it's likely his career wouldn't hold quite the same luster. His regular season stats, while respectable, don't stand out as extraordinary among his contemporaries. Many quarterbacks in his era posted better numbers without the same level of team success. Bradshaw's place in the top 10 quarterbacks of all time is solidified by his championships and his ability to come through in critical moments, but his overall stats might not place him there if not for those Super Bowl rings. His legacy is one of clutch performance and unforgettable Super Bowl moments, but it's important to remember the dynasty around him that helped make it possible. I'm not here to disrespect Bradshaw. He's undeniably a top 10 quarterback of all time, but I think people often overlook the beginning of his career, which was rough to say the least. It took him a few seasons to find his rhythm, and there were plenty of struggles and inconsistencies along the way. The interceptions piled up, and his performances in the early years weren't exactly what you'd expect from a Hall of Fame QB. It wasn't until he matured and the Steelers roster became fully loaded with talent that Bradshaw really came into his own. It's easy to get swept up in the highlight reels and Super Bowl trophies, but Bradshaw's story is more layered than that. He had his fair share of doubters at the start, and it took time, patience, and a stellar supporting cast to help him reach his potential. The early struggles make his story a great one, showing resilience and determination, but it's also a reminder that his career wasn't always smooth sailing. Bradshaw is a legend, no question, but to appreciate his journey fully, you have to remember where it began. Terry Bradshaw finished his 14-year NFL career with 27,989 passing yards, 212 touchdowns, and 210 interceptions. Known as a risk-taking gunslinger, his career completion rate was 51.9%, notably lower than some of his contemporaries, but fitting his aggressive play style. Bradshaw's quarterback rating sits at 70.9, reflecting a mix of brilliance and inconsistency. While he wasn't a statistical leader in passing yards or touchdowns compared to some of his peers, his postseason performance shone with a 14-5 record and 4 Super Bowl victories, solidifying his legacy. If you enjoyed this video, then I would appreciate you leaving a comment down below and let me know what other videos you'd like to see next. I am working on another one of these about Jim Kelly, who has lost more Super Bowls than anyone ever. We post videos a few times a week, so if you enjoy football content, you can subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another video.